In February 2022, Russia's President Vladimir Putin made a decision that shocked the global community. He invaded Ukraine. That war was meant to be a smash-and-grab operation, with Russia rolling in on tanks to secure Kyiv before establishing its rule in Ukraine as a whole. And it almost worked. Russian forces managed to enter Kyiv, albeit briefly, before resistance fighters pushed them back. Then that resistance started gathering steam. Most of the Western world supported Ukraine financially and provided military equipment, giving Kyiv the ability to fight back against Putin's aggression. To date, Western nations have pledged and provided over $380 billion in aid to Ukraine, with more on the way. This wasn't what Putin wanted. What was supposed to be an easy victory has devolved into a multi-year war that looks unlikely to end anytime soon. And yet, rather than withdrawing from Ukraine and accepting that it isn't going to achieve the easy victory it anticipated, Russia keeps pushing forward with the fight. But why? Putin's arrogance. That will be the focus of this video, as we explore how Putin's arrogance has led him into a no-win situation in Ukraine, and how, terrifyingly for the Russian public, Putin's ambition could be the death of his country. But before we dig into how Putin's arrogance will destroy Russia, we need to learn a little bit more about the man. Specifically, what drove him to invade Ukraine in the first place. Whenever he speaks publicly, Putin offers hints to one of the main reasons he invaded Ukraine. He is, if nothing else, a patriot, and he longs for the days when Russia was one of the world's most powerful countries. Putin wants to restore the glory days of the Soviet Union, ignoring all of the internal strife that period caused in his country, and wishes to restore Russia's dominance over the rest of Europe. We can see snippets of this agenda coming through in Putin's February 2024 interview with Tucker Carlson. In this interview, Putin tries to position himself less as an aggressor to the Ukrainian people and more as a savior to not only the country but the rest of Europe. Specifically, he claims that the denazification of Ukraine was one of his main goals with the war, with Putin telling Carlson, "We haven't achieved our aims yet because one of them is denazification." A seemingly noble cause. However, in one of the few times when Carlson pressed an issue in that interview, Putin was later asked if he would be satisfied with the territory he has now if he wins in Ukraine. Putin didn't respond to that question, instead returning to his point of denazifying Ukraine. The takeaway? Putin wouldn't be satisfied with just claiming Ukraine. He wants to restore Russia to its former glory. Other parts of that interview deliver a more direct throughline into his thinking. At various points, Putin engages in long and rambling diatribes, which he dresses up as history lessons, talking about how Russia and Europe were in the past. Though long-winded, these discussions reveal that Putin still sees Europe in old terms, with part of his justification for invading Ukraine seemingly boiling down to it was part of Russia before, and so it should be part of Russia now. To anybody who'd been paying attention to Putin's rhetoric when the war started, this was nothing new. In February 2024, the same month Russia invaded Ukraine, The Guardian reported on an hour-long speech Putin gave, in which he delivered his version of the history of Ukraine. Notable snippets from that interview include Putin claiming, "Ukraine is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space," as well as claiming the Bolsheviks made a massive mistake when they recognized Ukraine as a republic. The claims on land kept coming, when he also discussed how ceding territory as part of ending World War I was another mistake, along with lamentations of the loss of territory of the former Russian Empire. By this point, Putin's agenda seems clear. He wants a return to the old Russia. And to some, that may not be a sign of arrogance. It's natural for a patriot to want to see his country reclaim the glory days and take its position as a leader on the global stage. However, Putin's desire to restore Russia isn't driven by his love of country. It's driven by revenge and a desire for personal power. After all, Putin's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine is far from the first time that he's tried to control the country. It's just the most direct military attempt. He's made several tries at establishing Russian dominance in Ukraine over the past 2 decades. Take Ukraine's 2004 presidential election as an example. That election saw Putin's first real attempt to create what he calls managed democracy, a term the Carnegie Endowment for Peace says Putin uses to describe the type of regime he wants to create. In short, Putin doesn't want full democracy. He wants a shadow version, in which elections are held, but they're so lopsided toward his agenda that they may as well not exist. To that end, he poured all of his efforts into helping Ukraine's then Prime Minister, Viktor Yanukovych, secure the country's presidency. He failed. Despite spending an enormous amount of money on Yanukovych's campaign, as well as attempting to hinder the rest of the world's understanding of the election result, Putin couldn't get his puppet into office. Allegations of voter fraud abounded, with outgoing President Leonid Kuchma told that he had to dismiss the Central Election Commission's chairman by Charles Tannock, the European Parliament's delegation for Ukraine. Tannock said the chairman had clearly not been above board, going on to cite figures that suggested several parts of the country had seen voter turnouts of more than 100%. He added that absentee ballot abuse, ballot stuffing, and even intimidation of voters had taken place. Putin even campaigned on behalf of his preferred candidate, only to see tens of thousands of Yanukovych's opponent supporters line the streets of Kyiv to protest the official tally that had placed Yanukovych 3 points ahead. That opponent, Viktor Yushchenko, eventually received the backing of most of the Ukrainian parliament. The country's Supreme Court ended up annulling the election result, with Yushchenko coming out on top in a fairer vote several weeks later. Putin ended up shooting himself in the foot. By so radically backing Yanukovych to the point that he tried to pull off election fraud, Putin ended up with a president in Ukraine that he didn't want, and one who wouldn't be open to conciliatory talks with Russia. With his political maneuvering in tatters, Putin instead tried to rely on the KGB to get rid of Ukraine's president. Putin has been accused of attempting to assassinate Yushchenko soon after he took office, with that attempt failing as spectacularly as his attempt to influence the 2004 election in Ukraine. Putin was humiliated. In particular, his ego took a massive shot as the pride he felt as an astute political leader who could effortlessly influence policies in other countries was proven to be false. His efforts had blown up in his face, and he wasn't going to take the humiliation lying down. Though Putin veered away from trying to kill Yushchenko after his first assassination attempt ended, he still tried to have an impact on Ukraine's stability. We see this from multiple gas crises in Ukraine experienced as a result of Russian actions in 2006 and 2009. Both years saw Russia cut gas supplies off, supposedly due to disputes about pricing, with the effects of those cutoffs reverberating far beyond Ukraine. Russia has also spent the last 20 years building pipelines that allow it to circumvent Ukraine, this time creating a situation in which it could cut the country off while still maintaining relationships with other nations. You could argue that this attempt to scuttle Ukraine had a greater impact. A year after the second cutoff, Putin finally got his man, Viktor Yanukovych, in office. Between 2010 and 2014, Yanukovych reigned as president and immediately began making changes to the constitution. Putin had what he wanted, at least for a short time. But then the Euromaidan protests came in 2013 as a direct response to Yanukovych's refusal to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union. Instead, Ukraine's president ignored the country's parliament, which had voted overwhelmingly to approve the deal, and instead chose to create another trade agreement with Russia. As they did following the results of the 2004 election, Ukrainians took to the streets. Violent clashes between protesters and Ukrainian state forces resulted, with Yanukovych ultimately being run out of Ukraine. The country's parliament chose to remove him with a vote of 380 to 0, and Ukraine restored its constitution to what it had been in 2004. Putin had once again lost influence. Russian media cries of a coup fell on deaf ears. However, the protests and ousting of Yanukovych did open the door for Putin to annex Crimea, taking control of the territory away from Ukraine. This was the first sign of the lengths Putin was willing to go to in order to take the entire country. But by this point, he was likely no longer as fueled by a desire to reclaim the former Russia as he had been in the past. He had a personal agenda. Ukraine had humiliated him multiple times. It had gotten rid of the leader he wanted in power twice and survived even when he cut off gas supplies. Even the annexation of Crimea wasn't the victory Putin was hoping for. Ukraine still carried on, building stronger ties with the West as Putin saw the country slipping further and further out of his grip. His ego couldn't take it. And in his arrogance, Putin decided that he could take Ukraine easier by force rather than accepting the country as an independent state over which he had no real control. In this context, we can start to see the war in a different light. While Putin outwardly claims the war is about denazification and the restoration of the old Russia, internally there's a clear element of personal vendetta at play. Ukraine spent nearly 20 years deflecting Putin's influence, political, economic, and even military, showing Putin to be far less powerful as a political player than he believed himself to be. And that leads us to the third reason why Putin launched his war in Ukraine. Personal power may mean more to him than Russian dominance. Putin became Russia's president in December 1999, following a surprise address delivered by former President Boris Yeltsin. It was a rapid rise to power for a man who had only been appointed as Russia's prime minister 4 months previously, and in May 2000, Putin was inaugurated for his first full 4-year term after just scraping through an election with 53% of the nation's vote. No Russian election has been as close ever since. Putin won with 71.9% of the vote in 2004, with the next election taking place 8 years later, despite Russia supposedly having 4-year terms. That one was a little closer, with Putin taking 63.6% of the vote, though his nearest competitor, Gennady Zyuganov, only racked up 17.8%. 6 years later, Putin won another election, this time with 76.69% of the vote, with the most recent 2024 election seeing him take 87.29%. This is Putin's managed democracy in action, a system where he appears to compete with other candidates in elections that some accuse of being rigged. Putin has now tallied 24 years as the president of Russia, with no end in sight, and he'll likely try to maintain that position for the rest of his life. But what's interesting here isn't necessarily the possible rigging of elections over the last 24 years. Rather, Putin has also used war on multiple occasions to justify his position as Russia's leader. Open Democracy notes one theory that suggests the second Chechen campaign of 1999 helped Putin achieve his rapid political ascent. From previously being a relative unknown in Russian politics, he rose to become the president less than a year after that campaign, gaining a ton of popular support in the process. While the organization claims that theory likely isn't correct based on opinion polls at the time, Putin himself may believe that being seen as a strong wartime leader helped him to take the reins of power. Later wars, such as his Georgia campaign of 2008 and the annexation of Crimea in 2014, may have been less about claiming territory for Russia as they were creating a situation in which Putin could be seen as a strong leader. Sow some seeds of chaos and encourage the people to back their current leader ahead of anyone who might challenge him. Whatever the case may be, it's clear that Putin's arrogance has led him to believe that he is the only leader that Russia can rely on. He does everything he can to maintain power, with his 2022 invasion of Ukraine possibly being the latest attempt by him to stir up national pride so he keeps himself where he wants to be. And it appears to have worked, at least if you believe Russia's 2024 election results are legitimate. By this point, it's clear that Putin's arrogance is fueled by a combination of his desire to return Russia to its former glory and a need to be seen as the man who did it, a personal vendetta against Ukraine, and his thirst for power. But what Putin doesn't realize is that very arrogance may have placed Russia on the edge of destruction. Let's start explaining why by taking a closer look at the impact the Ukraine war has had on Putin and Russia as a whole. Putin's initial invasion was far from successful. Though Russian troops managed to enter Kyiv, they were repelled in what AP News calls a defeat for the ages. Russia also suffered tremendous losses to its Black Sea fleet and may have lost as many as 342 planes and 325 helicopters, if reports from Ukraine are accurate. Its personnel losses are at least 85,000, with Ukraine claiming they're much higher, which has forced Russia to engage in a war of attrition in which it attempts to wear Ukraine down. That alone has been damaging to Russia. Though the world still views Russia as a strong military power, it's no longer seen as one that can roll over a country that's meant to be substantially weaker than it. Granted, Russia would likely have won in Ukraine already were it not for the international aid that has propped up Kyiv almost since the war began. But Putin's arrogance, in assuming he could take Ukraine in a matter of weeks, has instead revealed Russia's military to be outdated and too reliant on numbers rather than modern equipment and sound strategy. In other words, a stronger country than Ukraine might now feel more confident in its chances of winning a war against Russia in the future. And that's especially the case after they've seen Russia lose so much of its modern equipment, forcing it to repurpose old Soviet hardware to keep its war machine churning. It gets worse for Russia. Whether it wins or loses the war in Ukraine, the country as a whole is going to feel the negative effects for years to come. A loss would likely result in it being stuck with the bill for rebuilding a country it has spent 2 years destroying, as well as Russia having to deal with being a less capable player on the geopolitical stage. It would also likely have to deal with long-running sanctions in the aftermath of a loss, such as a potential extension of the $60 per barrel cap currently in place on Russian oil. Then there's the continuation of other sanctions that have lowered the country's economic gross domestic product, forecast by 7% compared to pre-war estimates. And if Putin wins his war, he'll face the exact same problems. Those who oppose him and Russian aggression as a whole will keep sanctions in place, potentially for years to come. He'll also still need to spend big on rebuilding Ukraine, After all, he claims that it should be part of Russia, and he'll want it to be a functioning part, rather than a ghost country that can offer little more than shelled-out buildings. Worse yet for Putin, his rebuilding efforts would likely have to be done under the shadow of continuous Ukrainian resistance, meaning it will likely cost more to rebuild Ukraine if he wins than it would if he loses. Economically, Russia may not be able to survive, no matter the results of Putin's war. That may seem like a strange claim on the surface. The International Monetary Fund expects Russia's economy to grow 3.2% in 2024, which is a full 2 percentage points higher than the UK, and nearly the same amount higher than the EU. Its budget deficit is also much lower than both, tracking at 1% of GDP compared to the UK's 5.1% and the EU's 2.8%. All signs of a thriving economy, right? However, these figures hide the fact that Russia's economy is far from diverse. It relies heavily on exporting oil and gas, with so much of its recent economic growth stemming from the fact that it's able to charge so heavily for both as a result of the war that Putin started. So what happens when the war ends? Russia will be forced to pull those prices back down if it wants to continue selling its main exports, which is when the country will have to wake up to the economic issues that Putin's arrogance has caused. Take how he's spending the country's national budget. Russia is dedicating around 40% of that budget to the wartime effort, with total military spending reaching about 5.9% of GDP in 2023. That money is going toward paying soldiers, building tanks and planes, compensating the families of dead soldiers, and buying equipment from other countries that it can use to fund its war. When the war ends, that entire economic crutch crumbles. The thousands who currently have jobs in Russian factories building military equipment will find themselves out of work. Russia itself will see that it has very little left over in the national budget, and as a result of victory, the country would find itself increasingly isolated from the global community, and the West in particular, leaving it reliant on countries like China to prop it up. Speaking of China, Putin also doesn't realize just how much control Beijing has over Russia's fate. Take oil as an example. With the rest of Europe drastically reducing how much oil it buys from Russia in the wake of Putin's war, now only accounting for 4.5% of purchases, Russia is increasingly relying on China and India to purchase its products. Together, those countries now account for 90% of Russia's crude oil exports, which is a clear example of a lack of diversification. China is the main buyer here, with Reuters pointing out that it now buys 50% of the oil that Russia produces. That's good news for Russia in the short term. It's able to keep bringing oil money in, even as Europe drops from buying 45% of its production to 4%. However, it also leaves the country in a position where it's increasingly reliant on China to fund its economy. That leads to the obvious question: what happens if China stops buying Russian oil? That may not be a far-flung question, given China's recent reaction to threats of sanctions being placed against it for doing business with Russia. Reuters reports that many of China's major banks are pulling back on financing transactions related to Russia, forcing companies to turn to small and less reliable banks, or in some cases cryptocurrency, to continue doing business. The news outlet quotes a banker at one of China's Big Four when talking about the reason. The main reason is to avoid unnecessary troubles. In other words, the banks don't want to be sanctioned, as that could affect Chinese trade globally. While this banking shutdown appears to be mostly related to consumer goods and similar types of businesses, it shows us what China is willing to do if it faces increasing international pressure. Who's to say that it wouldn't stop buying Russian oil, or reduce the amount it's paying to meet the $60 cap Western nations have placed on the country's oil if it faced a significant amount of pressure? Either way, it's clear that Putin's arrogance has placed Russia in a no-win situation with China. If it continues relying on China to buy its gas and oil ahead of practically any other nation, it gives Beijing control over its purse strings. That could be a problem if China decides it wants to negotiate lower prices than Russia wants to charge, especially because Russia is quickly losing leverage that would allow it to keep prices high. And if China keeps pulling out of business dealings, as we're seeing as a result of the West's most recent sanction threats, Russia will realize that it's so dependent on China that it's little more than the country's junior partner. Not great for a man who wants to be seen as one of the leaders of the modern world. Certainly not a good outcome for a Russia that's already struggling to prop up an economy that's almost entirely dependent on war, oil, and gas. But Putin's actions haven't just harmed Russia's economy. They've also altered the global perception of the nation. We touched on this earlier when we pointed out that Putin's past failed attempts to control Ukraine ended in failure and exposed him as a less effective leader than he believes himself to be. And even though the world is rightfully wary of the threat Russia presents militaristically, it's also seeing a Russia that's struggling to defeat a much smaller country, albeit one that's being supported by the global community. Putin's arrogance has made Russia look weak, and he has also made himself look like a schoolyard bully. That's according to the Royal United Services Institute, which says that Putin's repeated threats of using tactical nukes in Ukraine are the sign of a man who's growing desperate. He wants Ukraine, the former Soviet territories, and the Western world at large to fear him. Instead, his actions are waking up many other countries to the threat that he presents as Russia's leader, which could, ironically, cause that threat to be limited. The reactions seen in the former Soviet states demonstrate that. In September 2022, Politico reported on the many losses of Russian influence across these states. For instance, Azerbaijan started shelling Armenia again during that month, breaking a ceasefire that Moscow had brokered. It was confident enough to do that because Putin pulled Russia's best troops out of the South Caucasus region, leaving the Russian-backed Armenia exposed. In Georgia, the blue and yellow flag of Ukraine is often flown in support of the embattled nation. Putin also saw himself snubbed by Kazakhstan's President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, who went as far as to claim his country doesn't recognize quasi-state territories, which, in our view, is what Luhansk and Donetsk are. Both are territories Russia currently controls in the war. The point here is that Putin is already struggling to control portions of his supposed empire, with a single war weakening his, and by extension, Russia's influence in these regions. Again, an example of how the Russian president's arrogance is actually weakening his country. Even more worrying are the reactions of the Western world to Putin's invasion. French President Emmanuel Macron has already claimed that NATO troops entering Ukraine is a possibility. And even though the rest of NATO denies this, Macron hasn't backed down from his comments and even claimed as recently as May 2, 2024, that there's still a possibility that French troops could enter the country. Even the many NATO members who won't commit troops are still sending plenty of aid. The UK recently approved $620 million in aid. With the United States going 100 times bigger, it's approved $61 billion in April. The problem for Russia is that this shows Europe and the Western world at large is slowly waking up to Putin's ambitions. Many countries are now increasing their military budgets in response to Russia's invasion, ultimately meaning they will be able to put up a much stronger fight if Putin tries to coerce or cow them. Far from claiming Ukraine as a great victory for Russia, Putin has galvanized Europe to the point where it will now be much harder for him to achieve his ambitions of returning his country to its Soviet-era glory days. Instead, Russia will just face stronger sanctions, a dearth of clients for its gas and oil, and will have to confront the fact that its economy is now almost wholly reliant on a combination of war and Chinese money. And then there's the last potential nail in the coffin: the massive demographic damage done to Russia as a result of the war. Russians are leaving their home country at a rate of hundreds of thousands. The Economist says that the outbreak of war led to an exodus of 300,000 people, with the BBC saying that estimates for the numbers since range from the hundreds of thousands to several millions. That's all happening against the backdrop of an extended demographic crisis that Russia has experienced since the collapse of the Soviet Union. During the Soviet era, the country's birth rate halved due to the uncertainty its people had as a result of economic hardship. Raising those birth rates has been a cause close to Putin's heart since he took power, and he's failed every step of the way. Our World in Data says that Russia saw just 9.6 births for every 17 deaths in 2021. With the war in Ukraine killing so many of Russia's younger people, along with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, more leaving, there may not be much of a Russia left by the time the war is over. All of this adds up to a country in crisis, one that, regardless of how the war in Ukraine ends, is in dire straits economically and in terms of geopolitical positioning. A Russia that's losing people at an alarming rate, and one that, as a result of Putin's arrogance and actions, could find itself playing second fiddle to China rather than rebuilding its empire in the coming years. But what do you think? Will Putin's arrogance truly lead to Russia's downfall? Or will victory in Ukraine give him the launching pad to rebuild what he believes the country has lost? How long would it take for Russia to rebuild in the wake of the war, especially if it loses? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Putin warns destruction of civilization is close, or click this other video instead.